The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. Today's guest is Lauren Polly. Lauren is a multi-award-winning and internationally best-selling author of the book Beyond Bipolar. She is transformational speaker, executive life coach, and medical speech-language pathologist. Lauren knows firsthand how a mental health diagnosis can also mean a life of labels, stigma, and limitation after being diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 14 following a suicide attempt. However, after exploring alternative treatments in addition to more traditional models of care, she quickly discovered the importance of treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Here to discuss holistic approaches for mental health and emotional well-being, living beyond the label, the power of self-reliance, and so much more, join me in welcoming our guest, Lauren Polly. Hi, Lauren. How are you? Thank you so much for coming to the show. We're really grateful to have you here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, no, as we were talking about a little bit before the show, we've been trying to explore mental health from a number of different angles. I think you have a really compelling story, and I think you have a lot of valuable information that will be just terrific for our audience. So without any further ado, let's get into it a little bit, and let's talk about who you are, where you come from, and where you fit in this space.
Well, I kind of have a myriad of different paths that have led up to kind of helping me talk on this topic. If you've read my book, it's called The Other Side of Bipolar, and that chronicles my journey from age 14 through age 30 with a mental health diagnosis of bipolar. Going through the Western medical system, having all sorts of judgment and stigma and need to keep it secret, kind of the status quo, I would say, on what we think about with someone with a mental health diagnosis, and sad to see how that is kind of leached over to anyone who is feeling blue or anxious is kind of shy to speak to it. So I know we'll get into that a little bit for some tools to help. I also run a hospital department. I've worked in the hospital system for 15 years now, and I've been doing tele-remote work for since the pandemic began, so about 3 months. So it's kind of been interesting to play with all these different sides, the mental health from my own personal side, and then coming at it from a life coaching perspective, which is my business, and then looking at how it fits into corporate life, to healthcare, and to just team dynamics, whether that's a team of family, a team of coworkers, or a team of the ecosystem of how the organization is run. So a lot of different stuff that we can plug into today.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's really good. And it's, good and bad, but at least you've had some opportunity recently to get into telework. And I'm sure that's revealed some problems for you that you've had to work through. And, much like everybody else is going through right now. And I will say too, I'm really grateful, that you're willing to share your story. I think it's one of the things that I think has been so cool and interesting about the other healthcare or mental health professionals that we've had on this program, is that most people are coming from a place of experience. Most of them seem to have had some sort of run-in with mental health problem and have worked through it. And then having come through it on the other side, they're now sharing their story and being helpful. And I think that's a pretty incredible thing to do.
Yeah, it takes a lot sometimes. And I think that's kind of my biggest target with this work is really just revealing it and pulling back the curtains. And, if someone is bold enough and vulnerable enough to do that, it makes the listener kind of go, oh, I could probably do that too. And all of a sudden the barriers to speaking to it, to getting help, and to really trying to make change in your life can actually be easier. So that's kind of my passion behind it all.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think that's so true. Obviously it helps reduce fear and trepidation, things like that, when you know that you're not so different. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really valuable. Well, let's dig right in then. So part of your story that I think is particularly interesting is I know that you had some struggles with sort of the Western style traditional medicine and sort of the way that they were handling mental health in the period of time when you were struggling and having your problems. As you proceeded, you began to do some research and you discovered some new holistic methods and things that were being done by people, sort of thinking outside of the box, I guess, so to speak. And so can you talk a little bit about that experience, just sort of what it was like going through the hard side or the problems that you had to work through, and then ultimately what you did that helped you find solace?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed at age 14, which is quite a tender age, you can imagine. And 14 through 20 was all just traditional Western medicine. And what I mean by that is you have a chemical imbalance. Here's a whole bunch of meds. I was swallowing 14 pills a day at my highest point, having all sorts of side effects. And I was also doing weekly therapy, which was great. I'm a big advocate of therapy. However, the model that was being used with me was kind of an older approach of all negativity, problem-based therapy, trying to find solutions. It's kind of the mindset that there's something inherently wrong with you and you keep having to dig to try to find the nugget to then finally be able to have a happy life. So it was hard dealing with the body stuff, the medicine stuff, of course, the stigma going through adolescence and my teenage years with a diagnosis. And then lightning struck and just, clouds parted when I was 20 and I met a holistic psychiatrist. And he was the first person in 6 years of treatment that talked about diet, exercise, meditation, mindfulness, just these things that are kind of ubiquitous right now in our time, but way back when it wasn't. But it changed so much for me. It really opened up my eyes to the fact that I'm not this label, and that thing doesn't have to be the thing that defines me. And it was really up to me, power in my hands, to actually take my eye off the big pink elephant and to develop other aspects of myself. And with that, everything started to change. And I think that's kind of the bigger thing I love to talk about, is the fact that we are multidimensional beings. And when we're shoved into a label of any kind, those labels are flat. They belong in a textbook. And sometimes they don't make room and space for all of you. And a lot of your parts and pieces go undiscovered and underappreciated.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation. I mean, it's sort of what happens, when we stereotype things or we do anything like that is we're basically taking somebody or something that's probably very complex and multifaceted, and we're reducing them down to just a single label. Mm-hmm. And, in your case, it was bipolar, and, but what does that really mean? You as a human, you were going through a lot of things, maybe this was a piece of it, but there were all these other components. And so I think it's, a great observation or something to point out that, this sort of labeling can be very difficult for people. Yeah. So as you proceeded and you started working through these holistic things, do you mind digging in or spending a little bit more time on sort of the different holistic things you did? And the reason I ask is, one of the things that happens for a lot of remote workers in particular is we spend a lot of time alone. And as a result, we're caught up in our own head a lot, and we get caught up in sort of some negative back talk and loops and things like this. And we end up, sort of in a negative frame of mind, or maybe we get a little depressed, or maybe we have, a myriad of other problems. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about a holistic approach is another thing we don't get a lot of is exercise or sunlight or, these other things. We're not really, many of us are sort of guilty of not taking care of ourselves. And so I'm very interested in sort of your holistic approach, that may, served you well, but may serve others as well.
Yeah, I think kind of the big thing with that, I mean, there's a couple of different points, but number one is to include your body in your mental health care. And so often we miss that. It's like talk therapy, or you take medicines, and sometimes the side effect of that is numbing out to your body. There becomes this disconnect and this kind of disassociation feeling. The same thing actually happens a lot when you look at computer screens or TVs or phones. Just a fun experiment to play with on your own. Go outside your apartment, your house, look at nature. Then come back and look at your TV screen or your computer screen. You'll notice all of your energy, all your awareness gets laser focused to just that. And that's where a lot of our problems breed, and they start to look like they're bigger than life itself. Our perspective actually goes into tunnel vision around it. So if you're working from home and you don't have people to talk to, you don't have a new environment you're going to, the tendency to just be on screens and have that really limited perspective, that kind of zoned in, it takes your body out of the equation, and it sometimes puts you so far up in your head that all you can really see is what's right in front of you. And that's a really tricky way to be. I mean, it's really hard to make change or any kind of self-improvement if you are focusing on that mindset,
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, because so many people talk about this like flow state people get into when they're working in front of a computer. You'll get kind of into this flow or into the, get into the zone where we're focusing all our energy, everything into this screen, and we're being wildly efficient on the screen or whatever, but you're so right about sort of this tunnel vision. Like you lose sight of everything around you, including the time and the people in your life and everything else. And so, so it's very interesting because it's sort of encouraged or sort of something that's supported in, entrepreneurial circles and things like that, where, get into this flow state and really get a ton done. You'll be so efficient, but you sort of don't even think about the other aspects.
That was really hard for me when I started building my business, because I would go to work at the hospital and I would have the people interaction and a little bit of computer work. And then I would come home and of course it was all on the computer by myself. And it was fascinating to me to watch what it did to my energy and the fact that my body got really sick of sitting in one position, and how easy it was to get into that flow state, but also the mindset behind that, of that I always had to be doing something if something was going to take off. And I think this is where productivity gets really weird. Of sometimes we think if we're spending our time, like you're paid for 8 hours a day, so therefore you should be plugged into your screen 8 hours a day, actually doesn't make the most productivity sense, but it also doesn't make for a happy worker. It doesn't make for a happy body. It doesn't make for a happy mind. I think you have to be even more creative when you're working at home. In the work environment, you have interruptions. You get up and you do your ergonomic walks to be able to move. There's all these kind of, the multitasking is very different. You have other people at play and unexpected things occur. You don't really have that at home. So when you are doing that, again, it's like this getting sucked in, and before you know it, the whole day is gone and you're just exhausted. What do? You usually plug in front of the television set, yet another screen.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And, you brought up a couple interesting things there. I mean, one is this idea of productivity, right? I mean, and it's interesting to me, or at least I can see a correlation sort of between the old way and the new way, sort of the same way that you were treated, in the early days with your mental health stuff. You began in sort of a time period when we were still kind of figuring out how to treat this stuff. We didn't really know. And then, of course, there'd been hundreds of years of working on it to that point. But man, things have evolved a lot in the last 10 or 20 years. And you see the same evolution happening in the workplace. And, there's so much of this that, these old things that we're trying to break out of. For example, you brought up the 8-hour day and, sort of this idea of being shackled to your computer the whole time, and you must be productive every moment of every day. And I do think a lot of more modern employers are starting to understand, the benefits of getting up and walking around, or working from home, or having some sort of flexible work arrangement. And, outside of the, the current pandemic anyway. And so I think that's a really good observation. I wanted to talk to you too. You've mentioned the term a couple times, energy. And it's made me wonder too, how this correlates. Obviously, there's a correlation between this energy and this holistic work that you've been doing. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that. It's funny because it's one of those topics that I feel like almost everybody understands. Like, right, when you talk about an energy, even if people go woo-woo or whatever and kind of get a little dismissive about it, I think most of us can recognize that there's something sometimes, when you're in a room, it feels a certain way, or when you're around a person, it feels a certain way, that kind of thing. I mean, so it's clear that even though we may not know what to call it, there's certainly some kind of something out there. And so I'd be curious to hear your take, on this energy and how it sort of dovetails into this holistic care.
Yeah, so the energy, I like to think of it as your sensorial awareness of the world and the people around you. And it's sensorial in a way where you can feel it in your space, in your body. Your mind may get busy, you're anxious around certain people or certain environments. And none of that has to do with what's actually on the surface. It doesn't match what people say. Sometimes like you meet somebody and they're smiling at you, but you get that kind of feeling in your gut. It doesn't match the smile they're giving, but you can sense deep down that they actually aren't happy to see you. And most of us are living with relationships, just dynamics in general, that where the surface doesn't actually match the energy underneath it. And that can create a lot of confusion. That was one of my major issues when I was younger. I'm very sensitive and very aware to the energy. And when people are saying something or looking a certain way that doesn't match that, I got very, very lost and very confused with it. I also got in a lot of stress cycles because I was trying to figure it out constantly. Do I pay attention to what they're saying or what I'm feeling? And a lot of times they just didn't match. So it's kind of a fascinating thing if you look at it. When I do presentations at the hospital about self-care for the caregiver, one of the ways I explain this is kind of like the Mondays, where you're feeling really good, everything's perfectly fine, you get on the elevator, you're in a group of people, and someone turns to you and goes, ugh, Mondays. And before you know it, you're like, yeah, Mondays suck. Like 2 minutes ago, you were perfectly happy and fine that it was Monday. That is a very clear indication of not only number one, were you aware of their energy, but number two, you just sucked it up and made it your own. And this is the really insidious thing is energy is so pervasive. And when you're not really paying attention to those undercurrents, kind of that unseen that's in the environment, a lot of times you end up taking it on as yours and your entire day gets colored as a result of it. Still happens remotely. If you get an email that is a bit more sharp toned, if you're on a Zoom meeting with your team and there's a weird dynamic, you still pick up on it. Just because you're home doesn't mean you're isolated in that way, Yeah,
no, it's so true. And it's funny that you bring up email, for example. I know that, most of us, grossly over-evaluate how great of communicators we are via email and text and things like that. And so it's so funny how just a misworded email or a clumsily worded email could make you feel a certain way based on the emotional implications that you're applying to that message. Mm-hmm. Even though it may have, almost nothing to do with the writer's perspective, you as the reader are applying these different things to it and able to kind of run with it. And then, like you say, color your day with it. Sort of related to this, but taking like half a step back, I wanted to talk a little bit more, explore a little deeper, this idea of overcoming the label. So in your case, you were a young person when you were doing this, so I imagine it was quite a struggle. I'm sure it's a problem for older people as well, but it seems like, especially as a person who's just trying to navigate life anyway, as a young person, you've got so much more to figure out still. Maybe as an older person, it's a little more you're a little more able to handle it. But I wanted to talk about that sort of as it pertains to self-esteem and that self-care that you mentioned. I think for so many people, or a big part of this ability to overcome that label is sort of finding yourself and getting confident in yourself. And I think for a lot of people, especially people who spend a lot of time alone, it can be pretty easy to slip into this cycle where you kind of aren't that confident anymore. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, in your own experience, how it worked to sort of overcome that label and find the, whatever it is, internal fortitude or whatever, to be able to carry on and get over that, but also how you might teach others to sort of, find that for themselves.
Yeah, and I love looking at labels as not just like a diagnosis like I had. Obviously, that's kind of a big red button. But look beyond that. Just right now, if you haven't been labeled with anything, what role have you taken on or have you been given? And a lot of us will do that insidiously, where we are like the perfect mom. And before you know it, that's like the one thing you have to live up to. It defines you. Or you're the one who always messes up. And before you know it, that's a role that you've taken on that you're fighting against. So the definitions, the roles, the labels, they're all kind of part and partial. Basically, they're putting you in a box that you, number one, either have to acquiesce to, kind of lay down and die and kind of say, okay, this is all that I'm going to be, or that you have to fight to get out of. And a lot of us take that stance where we then try to buck the system and spend a lot of our energy trying to prove ourselves otherwise. Neither of those two actually really create. You know, if you're accepting your label and kind of going, well, this is the role I'm going to have, that's all that I am, it's really hard to find that self-confidence because your whole personality and identity is wrapped up in it. But on the flip side too, if you're fighting against it, you're never really taking that open exploration to discover what's right about you. You're fighting against what someone said was wrong about you. And that's a really, really, really hard place to live. Again, it happens in the workplace all the time. We get critiqued by our superior or a coworker, and before you know it, you're not in the mindset of going, what am I good at here? You have a label in your head of, oh, I'm really bad at that thing. Now I have to fight to prove that I'm not. And it takes all of your creative energy out the window. So the label for me is just that. It's kind of a stopping point. It's like the ultimate judgeable offense that no matter what, you're either going to fight with it or you're going to have to lay down for it. It's really the work of being able to go, if I wasn't this box, if I wasn't this label, what am I? And that's just an exploration. That is a constant self-discovery exercise.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it's funny, it reminded me of this just ancient story in our life. And I mean, it's, pretty, not that big of a deal. So I mean, I don't want to try and come across that this is something important, but it's funny because we just talk about a label, and a label not necessarily being a diagnosis, but it could be anything. For whatever reason, about 30 years ago, me and my wife became known as the people who were always late to my wife or to my mother, which is hilarious because I'm never late to anything. I'm 5 minutes early to everything. And my wife was bad when we were teenagers, but, has grown out of that. And we're very on time. We're very punctual people. But to this day, my mom always gives us that, oh, and don't be late. Oh, this, whatever, because we've got this label. Now, we've spent our whole life trying to overcome the stupid thing, but we just can't shake out of it, But it is funny how that is something that has been put on us. And now there's this, thing in her memory where it's sort of tied to us, that experience. And we just can't shake the thing at all. So it's funny how you can, like you said, either become the label, in which case we ought to take advantage and be late more often. Otherwise, move past it and try and move outside of it and just accept the fact that my mom's not going to change her ways.
And you have to challenge the perspective. You have to challenge your own perspective first and foremost, because a lot of other people, if you're trying to change it in their eyes, you're in a losing battle. It's never about the other person. It's never, even in a bad relationship, it's never about the other person. That is a misnomer you're going to get stuck in. It's about yourself, what you're leading, what you're creating in your life, and what choices you have. But being able to challenge that perspective for you, at least, that actually opens up more areas to explore. And a lot of us don't go there. We have those little things like I'm the late one or I'm the shy one, and then you can never really be bold in your choices. These are insidious, and they are handed to us left and right as we grow up.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's funny because that sort of dovetails nicely into this next topic I wanted to get into, which was the idea of sort of internal stuff that we need to work over versus the external things, the things that are put on us. And so as we were starting to discuss, these ideas of self-esteem, self-care, and further, I'd like to take this into self-reliance. These, they're sort of all fruit of the same tree, it seems like, right? These are all sort of internal strengths, and confidence that need to be developed over time, so that you can overcome sort of the labels that you're giving yourself. In addition, not to sound too conspiratorial, but sometimes people are out to get you. And sometimes they are thinking things about you, or, much like my silly late always kind of thing, sometimes people put things on you, whether you like it or not. And so I wondered if you'd talk a little bit, just maybe a little deeper on what we might do, to sort of continue developing our skills as it pertains to developing full self-reliance. And then also sort of externally, and I think you sort of just touched on this with the idea that we, are being bombarded by external sources all the time, and how we need to work through that. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the external sources unfortunately probably won't go away, but the way to deal with it is to build up your internal fortitude, and my favorite tool for this with the self-reliance, and really this kind of like, how do I trust me? Because a lot of times if you don't trust yourself, whatever comes at you becomes the truth when really it's not. My favorite tool for that is called the light and the heavy tool from Access Consciousness. And it's an energy one, so just go with me on this. Whatever is true for you makes you actually feel lighter, makes you feel more relaxed, makes you feel more spacious. Whatever is not true for you feels like an elephant sitting on your chest. It contracts your space, it makes your head busy, it makes your body uncomfortable. Very sensate things to start tuning into. And with that, what's true for you, Ryan, isn't true for me necessarily, because you're different. And I'm different, but we are taught for some reason that there is some sort of shared reality here where everything has to match. That's not necessarily the case. And so sometimes when someone comes at you with their point of view of what they need from you, what they expect of you, and most often or not, how you're not living up to it, it's really easy to get lost. At that moment, you have to tune in. Does that actually make me feel lighter? Does it bring an ease to my space? Does it interest me and make me want to lean forward? Or does that feel really heavy and contracted? And if it makes you feel heavy and contracted, that may be true for them, but it's not true for you. You don't have to do anything with it. You just need that internal fortitude to go, oh, that's their stuff, that's not mine.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And I love that idea of light and heavy. It's funny because as you think about just your emotions in general, when you're sad or you're brought down, you feel heavy. And when things are going great and the sun is shining and you're out having a great time, then you do feel light. And so, it's a little bit of a, parallel maybe thought, but I do think that, this concept anyway of light versus heavy energy, I think is something that we can all relate to.
Yeah.
So I wonder, as we talk a little bit more about getting into self-reliance, we, have gone through maybe these early steps of starting to do a little bit of self-care and starting to be a little bit introspective. And as it pertains to remote work, for those of us who basically we need to be able to be on time, we need to be able to do all these things, we've got all these rules and regulations and things around our lives that we need to be able to live up to. And so I wonder, as you're talking about sort of self-reliance, if we could talk a little bit about sort of belief patterns and things like that as they pertain to this ability to, I guess, kind of manage our lives. And I think it maybe is an extension of what we've been talking about, this idea of belief patterns. We're believing what, we hear internally and what people are telling us externally. But I wonder if you'd just talk a little bit about that, just sort of how we get into that self-reliance space.
Well, the belief patterns are fascinating. They're kind of, for me, similar to thought patterns, kind of our cognitive level. And beyond that, our behavior patterns, how kind of our behaviors match those thoughts, match those beliefs. They're all kind of part and parcel with each other. One visual that's kind of cool to look at is if you're looking at the ocean and you start to notice the paths of the water as it moves through. It's not because the path of the water is coming from the surface. It's the grooves in the sand all the way at the bottom that are directing the water flows. And belief patterns are like that. They're super, super, super deep seated. And before you know it, it's like if you're trying to change things on the surface, it can get super frustrated because the actual work has to come with smoothing the sand deep, deep, deep down. Part of that is actually being very honest with yourself. I'm a big fan of journaling. There's something about putting pen to paper or hands to keyboard in this day and age, or even talking on your cell phone. I do that a lot with my voice memos if I don't want to write. But being able to actually journal about your day, talk about what came up for you, and then actually challenge those beliefs, look deeper. What are those underlying currents that you start to see? Because you may actually start to see some themes. You may start to see, I'm never good enough, or everyone else is always out to get me. There are people who just have these deep-seated beliefs that they're never truly going to be happy and or productive or good workers because deep, 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 deep down, they don't have that belief system with themselves. You can start actually noticing that that's a really fun way to do it, actually journaling, audio, and or writing or typing, just so you can start to see where your own themes come. And from there, you have to actually do the work of challenging those. I mean, that's modern day therapy. That's really like, what's your deep-seated belief? And is that actually true? And one really, really, really powerful tool, very easy to use with that, when you wake up in the morning, all you have to do is start your day with a question. Because if you're functioning from your belief systems, you're already in conclusion. You're like, this is the way I am. This is the way my life goes. This is the way people are going to react to me. End of story. You've taken yourself out of the possibility of anything different. Wake up in the morning instead and say, if I wasn't the one who always messes up, what else could I do today? If I wasn't the one where people were always coming after me, what else could I do today? And taking your limiting belief and flipping it into an exploration that way, kind of a wonderment, you may be surprised at what actually comes your way. I find information finding me. I find new people coming into my life. I also see people kind of reflecting that same behavior pattern and thought pattern. And it makes it really easy to go like, wow, that's what that was for me. I don't really need to do that. You start to see how kind of insane it is when somebody else does it for some reason. It's hard in your own head.
Yeah.
But those are kind of easy ways to actually start working on smoothing out the sand so that way your life, that kind of pattern in the water, can start to shift and change.
And how much of that kind of thing, especially that topic in particular, sort of resonates with me? I have some people I'm thinking of in particular that, could benefit from trying to work through those sorts of problems. I mean, how much of this is stuff that would be fairly expected that you solve yourself? And I mean, ultimately, I think in modern therapy, most of the work is to be done by yourself. Like if you're not willing to do the work, it's probably not going to work. But like, at what point do we know when it's time to seek professional help? Like, so for somebody like this, a person in particular that I have in mind, he's been this way for a long time. He's had sort of these kinds of thoughts over a long time, and I'll just make some up so that he doesn't know who I'm talking about. But sort of, the I'm not good enough, or the, I'm expected to be this way, therefore I can't do anything else kind of thing. And, so much of that, I mean, it starts to turn into what looks like a paranoia or something, and it actually becomes kind of off-putting. And so I wonder, for somebody like him, like, is it enough to tell him, oh, well, why don't you try this? Or, at what point should somebody, and maybe this goes back to the stigma question, when is the right time to start looking for therapy or looking for professional assistance?
Yeah, there's kind of like two different talking points to that. Number one, just keep in mind, it's really hard to change anything for anyone else. I would dare say impossible. It has to be their choice, truly. And a lot of times, if you've ever in your life cared about somebody and wanted to help them and said, hey, have you looked at this? You can even look at how they responded. Most of the time, they get very angry. It's always smoother when the person who's in it actually goes and asks for help, makes the reach. It's very difficult. It's like giving advice that is unsolicited, right? It doesn't mean you can't poke and prod on the way there or speak to a relationship dynamic where I don't know if you realize it, but this is the way you treat me, and that doesn't work for me. You always kind of have to bring it back to your own choice in the matter. I think the individual, whenever that pattern is destructive to your life, is when to seek help. And most of us see destruction as like, I can't get up out of bed in the morning, or there's something really big going on. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, just destruction in of itself is you not actually making life choices that serve you. You constantly building unhealthy relationships with people who take advantage of you. You getting into jobs that are kind of like underpaid. You're kind of in that always self-deading mindset where you never really ask for what you're worth. Those things are destructive to your being. So if you have any of those things going on, stepping out for therapy, for coaching, whatever calls to you would be actually super helpful. But again, it has to be your own choice point. Usually that's where the true change comes, trying to change a relationship partner, or like a boss managing a staff, trying to change their basic beliefs. Oh boy,
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think so much of it too is again, like we pointed out a couple of times now, the timing, right? I mean, it seems it's become much more acceptable in these younger generations, but for people of my age and older, I just turned 40. I look at like my parents' generation, for example, and the idea of seeing a therapist is just crazy, and so, I mean, it just wasn't going to happen, by my age, or, sort of the people that grew up around my age, or maybe it's just me, it seems much more acceptable. But even at that, there's still sort of some trepidation or some whatever around it, this built-in stuff that I've gotten from my parents. And then, the next generation of kids, like it's the first thing they do. They've got the therapist app, and they're calling people up. And so I think we're definitely making positive progress on all this stuff, but it's still a challenge for sure.
Yeah, in a good way, like if you're curious about it, I know a lot of companies have like an employee assistant program. And that's really an easy touch base. It's usually free, it's limited sessions. You just kind of go for like a pain point that you're going through currently. I saw someone at a hospital I worked at years and years ago when my friend passed away in the war. I just needed grief counseling. And I didn't need to dive into deep, heavy stuff for years and years. I just needed like 3 or 4 sessions to cry and express myself. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. Maybe you're going through a change point in your life and you're feeling a bit uncomfortable or unclear. That might be just an easy way to start exploring it and see if it actually suits you.
Well,
there are a lot of resources.
I actually think that's a really great point too. This idea that you could use it sort of sporadically as needed. I think a lot of people have this idea of the brain, of the shrink that you're going to go see for the rest of your life, and you're going to be there 3 days a week, and it's this whole thing, and so nobody ever commits because, my God, it's a lifelong commitment. And so, but I love this idea of sort of sporadically using it as needed. And actually, I can think of instances in my own life where I wish I had.
Well, it's so funny too. I mean, me with a bipolar label, like weekly therapy at the get-go, needed, absolutely. And then that was age 14. By age like 24 and graduate school, I was going to a therapist, and I didn't really have anything to talk about. I was just kind of making stuff up. And she looked at me and she said, do you think you really need to be here? And I'm like, but I thought this is what I was supposed to do, like forever and ever, amen. And she's like, you don't have anything to talk about. You don't have to come and pay me anymore. So it's kind of a funny thing. Sometimes we do have that mindset where it is like a lifelong investment. Even with a label, that's not the case. You need to go, you need to get tools, and you need to move on. And anyone who's invested in keeping you as a client forever and ever and ever, that might be a red flag. It may be some time to look for somebody different to work with,
Yeah, that makes great sense. So let's transition a little bit. There was one other piece of your experience that you touched on that was this idea of sort of people pleasing and perfectionism. This is something that you see running rampant. It's especially, expectations are becoming higher and higher in the workplaces. And especially as we go remote, employers, especially people who aren't particularly familiar with remote work, are micromanaging the heck out of people. And, this idea that everything must be perfect and everything must be done quickly and on time and all this stuff is sort of ramping up. And so I wonder if you couldn't talk about that in your own experience, and then also how we can cope with that as a individual.
So let's talk about that deep sand again. That's basically kind of pushing us all towards pleasing others and being perfect and getting it just right. Deep, 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 deep down, it's a control issue. How often when you are forcing yourself to perfection over and over and over again, does it come back to a lack of control belief? And it's funny because life and pandemic has taught us that more than anything. It is very uncertain. Tomorrow isn't promised, and what tomorrow looks like, who knows? There's a creative power to that, but also there's a lot of fear in that for a lot of people as well. They like their predictable reality where they know what's coming. It becomes kind of a false sense of control. And a lot of times when you're getting into perfection tendencies, I always call that my second insanity I went through, was my perfection tendencies. That's exactly what it is. It's trying to control everything to a specific outcome instead of just relaxing a little bit and seeing what actually flows. It's also so strange because if you're looking at managing a workforce, allowing people to grow in their skill sets is going to actually require allowing them to have the space to fail a bit, to figure things out on their own and to really discover. And if people are so scared of failing or needing to be just so, or to please you constantly, really that growth edge is never going to be there. I talk about that a lot in my podcast. It's more on life development. And for yourself, just looking at, okay, I'm stopping myself because of a lack of control. I'm stopping myself because I'm fearful and I'm afraid of not getting it perfect, and I'm afraid of failure. But with that, you're never going to grow. You're never going to test those edges. And if you look at the really highly successful people in the world, they swung for the fence, They would never have been able to do that if they were getting micromanaged, either by somebody else or within themselves. Because a lot of us will do that constantly edit and micromanage what comes out of our mouth, how we sit, how we look. Maybe not working from home so much as a PJ party. I get a lot of the time. But there is that tendency to want to comb everything. And that's just not a creative or relaxed space to live through.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think you touched on a couple of things I'd like to maybe explore a little deeper. One of the things that, especially as an employer, if you are managing a workforce and you are micromanaging, or you are almost codependent with some of the people you're working with, and you've developed this relationship where you've got to be on top of every little stinking thing, obviously, having gone remote, you'll probably make yourself nuts before you make everybody else nuts. But I wonder if, one of the big things there, in this idea of relinquishing control or giving up some of this control is this element of trust. Mm-hmm. There's so many different ways that we sort of develop trust as we, have relationships with people and things like that. We do, act in certain ways or we behave in different ways, and that sort of lends to this trust over time. But for an employer, do you have any thoughts on how you might sort of get to a place where you're feeling okay about relinquishing a little control? There's sort of this long-term approach, but like short, like you can only sort of see the short term, and you really want to control all these people, and so maybe a little self-preservation. You're kind of covering your own butt, but you've got, but in reality, your team would serve you better. You'd be much more efficient, and everything would be going better if you just kind of stay out of the way. And so I wonder if you couldn't talk a little bit about sort of just developing trust in relationships.
Yeah, well, I think the important distinction with that is there's a difference between trust and blind faith. And a lot of us, because we think trust means blind faith, meaning like, I don't even have to look at you. You should just be able to take this and run with it. Or, of course, you're going to create the best thing because I believe in you as a person. That's something very different than actually being very, very clear on who you're dealing with. Like, I manage a staff at the hospital job that I work at, and my emotional intelligence, my boss always says, like, you have such a high degree of emotional intelligence and it serves you well because I know the way my staff ticks. I know their pain points. I know how they act under stress. Being able to be very non-judgmental and accepting of all of it, just to be able to have clear eyes, that's trust because I know exactly how they're going to act. They may surprise me, who knows? But I know what their strengths are and I know where their weaknesses lie as well. I know where my own are, and I'm very forthcoming with that. Being able to have that, that's actually a different level of trust than this blind faith of like, I'm just going to check out. When you're able to manage that way and just touch in enough where you know the weak spots that may need a little bit of a push, may need a little bit of a highlight, that's something different than trying to control every single little thing. It's also kind of fascinating too, like the jobs that I've left in the past, I left them because there was no room to grow. And I am very much into living on the creative edge. If there's not a place for me to grow my skill set and to keep pushing, then I lose interest very, very quickly. And I'm very cognizant of that with my own staff, of being able to relinquish enough where they get to build their own resume. They get to actually build their own and explore. I tried that. I wasn't good at it and I didn't like it. Okay, cool. You don't have to do that again. But there's a bigger picture here where I think that control thing comes in, and we look very much right now and today or my deadline or the pay period. We don't actually look broader target here, health of the company, staff retention, and also that staff member who may retain at your facility for 10 years, but then they're going to go off and have a career. What can you contribute to them along the way? It's a mindset shift from the top down that really has to occur with that.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, maybe one of the words that we could sort of assign to this, not in the spirit of giving labels anyway, but is this idea of empathy. And basically developing strong empathy skills as a employer, as a manager. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? So, empathy as it pertains to trust. I like your distinction between trust and blind faith, because I do think that that's a large problem for a lot of people. Is I think that's where the disconnect is for a lot of companies that are struggling to give people some latitude. Yeah, I think it is this fear of just kind of giving it all up, like it's either all or nothing. And so, but I do think that a contributor to developing this trust is developing this empathy and actually caring and understanding, the needs of your people. And so I think that some people are maybe a little more naturally inclined to be empathetic, but is that a skill that people can learn and actually develop?
Yeah, I'm very empathetic by nature. I always say that's my secret superpower because there is a very creative space to be in. Now, when I was younger, that was actually something that took me down, quote unquote, crazy train. I was so empathetic that I thought everybody else's problems were my responsibility. And beyond that, I thought their problem was my problem. So before you knew it, I lost myself. That's like empathy to the extreme. You don't have to go there. There comes a highly intelligent space where you can use it creatively. You can go, I see how they're feeling. I can actually sense how they're feeling. I can see their mindset and their limiting beliefs around the current situation. How do you, as the manager, as the person who's kind of leading that dynamic, how do you shift to be able to meet them where they are? And hopefully lead them to a place of greater possibility. And that's kind of taking your empathetic skills and making it a creative place for relationships, not just, oh, I'm empathetic, I'm going to hold your hand. That really won't work as a manager, because then people get away with murder. You have to be able to go, I see where you're coming from. Here's the expectation and what has to get done. Perhaps you have a different way that would suit how you function better. And I think that's another interesting thing with this empathy conversation. It allows you to see people's differences, and their differences are what makes them great. But a lot of us don't give people in set roles in the company the bandwidth to be creative with that. We expect them to do it like their coworker does. And it's cutting back on like actually the contribution they could be to the company.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, and we've sort of talked or touched on this a little bit throughout the conversation, but the idea that, our weaknesses, or what are perceived as a weakness by you, may actually be our strength. Mm-hmm. It might be the skill that actually, helps us approach a problem in a different way, or, whatever it might be. And so I think that, it is important to try and look at those things, more through that flip that you described, sort of look at it as a positive instead of as a negative. One of the things you sort of touched on in there, and maybe we could spend a minute on, is this idea of mindset. So much of the work we're doing, we approach in different ways. And like we discussed earlier, the idea that our mindset, or the way we feel on any given day, can be so widely affected by everybody. But I think sort of underneath this bit of conversation is this idea of intent and setting a proper intention. And I wonder if, for basically everything self-help and self-awareness, it, really makes sense to make sure we're setting strong intentions. And I wonder what your thoughts are about intention and how people can leverage that to, make for a better mindset, or to become more self-aware.
Mm-hmm. I always say, don't just handle today, create tomorrow. And I think that is so important. And most of us have the mindset of like, I just got to get through today. We live on autopilot. We kind of are, look for the next time as you're moving through maybe this coming week that you actually have a creative space in your workday. A lot of us don't even have that in our personal life. We just have the to-do checklist. I go do this, I check email, I return phone calls, I check out, I drive my kids around, I cook dinner. Because we are so overly scheduled, we don't really have the bandwidth for creativity. And for me, creativity is kind of what makes people happy and healthy. I love what Elizabeth Gilbert says, the author of Eat, Pray, Love. She says, creativity is an inherent gift that we all have. But for some reason, we give it up when we become an adult. We get responsible and we give up that play time. A lot of times that playtime can come into your daily work if you have the mindset of actually exploring, of being really present with what shows up, and allowing yourself to maybe do things differently than you've done before, experimenting or lab working it a little bit more. It's just kind of interesting having that mindset coming into your day of like, I can see how my entire day is going to go, and I know I'm going to rinse and repeat it tomorrow. That is like an autopilot mindset. And that's one that you probably want to break, especially for your own mental health and, again, greater well-being.
Yeah. Another thing that is sort of in the ether these days, we're hearing a lot of talk about gratitude. And I think that, I think it's true that we should have gratitude about different things like that. And I think that it's also really tightly integrated with intention and empathy and all these other things that we're discussing rather. But can you talk a little bit about the role gratitude plays in this stuff?
Gratitude, I think, is one of the key elements that makes a happy person happy. And it's interesting because there is so much talk about like gratitude journaling, and you can look for yourself if you've ever tried to do that. Have you actually meant what you've written down? Or is it usually like you're trying to look for gratitude as a way to kind of like smear over something you're upset about? So you have to kind of look, am I putting lipstick on the pig here, so to speak? Or am I actually tapping into the energy of this thing actually does create? Even the stuff that looks like crap in my life, I'm grateful for it because it pushes me. It makes me look deeper. It actually pushes me to the next level. Another really key thing with the gratitude, we've talked a lot about judgment, kind of indirectly and directly on this. Judgment's kind of the silent killer. It's what keeps you in that box we talked about. It's also what puts you at the effect of other people when they judge you and you buy it. Judgment and gratitude can't coexist. They are actually opposing energies. If you're judging someone, you are completely in a lack of gratitude for them. Vice versa. If you have true gratitude for something, you actually can't have a judgment towards it. You're just letting it all kind of seep into your world. So that's a really easy way to play when you're irritated, or when you've got like a big judgment coming up about a relationship partner. Flip it to gratitude and actually mean it. Don't lipstick on a pig. And same thing, that's just the more gratitude that you actually welcome into your life, but actually functioning from there, the less judgment you're going to have. And from there, more open possibilities and more of a greater sense of well-being.
Yeah, no, I think you're so right. Let's shift gears a little bit. We're starting to get towards the end of this thing, and I'd like to talk a little bit about your book and about sort of the process of putting this book together. You know, obviously these were probably painful times for you and probably something difficult to go back and recount. Yet I think that your willingness to be so open and transparent about the experience that you had and be willing to share your experiences so that maybe others might, either handle it better or be able to better navigate their seas, I think is really great and really, a awesome thing to do for society and for people in general. But will you talk a little bit about that process of just sort of putting your thoughts together, maybe reliving these memories and everything, and then how you made the decision to put that into sort of book form, and then what's come from it for you?
I started off teaching yoga and meditation, and then that kind of led into life coaching. And I had just noticed that every time I didn't share a textbook tool with somebody, but I actually framed it from my own personal history and what I had to overcome and how I dealt with it, they were able to receive it in a totally different way. And it wasn't like an authority credibility thing. It was an empathy, oh my God, you've walked it and you're willing to walk with it kind of thing. And more than anything, that's the impact I'd like to have. And that's how I'd like to lead my life in this world, of being able to walk with others. And for me, that's what this entire book is. You follow me on my journey. There are tools and techniques interwoven through the whole thing. But it really is a journey of us walking together from whatever wrongness, judgment, label, whatever, to looking at it from a different angle, actually discovering what's right about you, your strengths, and more importantly, really just like embracing your creative power again. So yeah, you don't have to live by anyone else's terms. You actually get to create your own. And I know that more than anybody. I was handed the label at age 14. Here are your list of personality characteristics that come in. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. And that was it at age 14. And I went, oh, this really, really sucks. And it took years of like fighting it again, fighting against the box, before I finally had the good fortune to meet people who were willing to go, you actually aren't that box. You aren't that thing. You are way more. Step off the two-dimensional and into the multi-dimensional and explore yourself. And for me, that's the greatest invitation of all, you know?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. You touched on something, and I had actually meant to bring this up and just talk about it a little bit briefly, is meditation. So this is one of those things that, you've got your share of people that think it's kind of woo thing. And then you've got your other group of people that are diehard, really, really believe in meditation. But as somebody who's taught it, and obviously, it's part of your practice, can you talk a little bit about meditation and the role it can play in sort of helping us solve mental health problems?
Meditation for me always felt like dipping into kind of this black velvet womb thing. For me, it always felt very nurturing and also very settling. And for me, I always had a lot of energy. I had a very anxious mind, again, more bouncy mood. So to be able to like be still and settle was very, very healing. I would put it out there that there are tons of different kinds of meditation. And sometimes the people who are like, I hate meditation, they just haven't found the one. There's walking meditation, there's running. Running actually can lead you into a meditative state because it busies your body enough that your mind starts to get quiet. You can think about it outside the box. Mindfulness. I personally done a lot of more tantric meditation, mantra-based. I studied years and years kind of deep philosophy with that. So it was a bit more hardcore. And then there's one of my favorite techniques. It's called the access bars. And that is a body process where somebody runs energy through your head. It sounds very woo-woo, but it takes you into a very, very deep meditative space. And you don't do anything. You get off the table after an hour and you're like, wide awake, reset button hit, ready to go. And for me, that's kind of what any of these meditative experiences are. They're really like hitting the reset button. They get you really present with yourself, let you unwind, and give you back your creative potency. It's hard to keep going all the time. You need to unwind a bit.
Yeah, I love that. It's actually, it's been impossible for me. I'm one of these guys too, that I stay very busy. My schedule's always booked, go all the time. And so I've always put off things like meditation. And I have an experience one time, I did a thing, I don't even remember how I came across it, on a CD or something. I found a yoga nidra meditation. And I think it might be sort of similar to what you're describing with this access bars thing, where basically you're supposed to trace this light to different parts of your body. And, it runs down to your toes, then over to your fingers and all this stuff. And you sort of trace this light in your mind. And for me, I actually had like a brief moment where I sort of felt out of body with it, which was really kind of insane for me. I'd never had anything like that. I have not, however, been able to reproduce it. Like, it only happened the one time for me, but I felt like I finally, I went all in, right? And so I've been chasing that dragon ever since, I guess. But it's been, but it's been one of these things that I don't really make time for, but even though I sort of am a true believer. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy. I won't do the best thing for me always.
But it's also interesting too. It's like what you talked about I won't go into therapy because it's a lifelong endeavor and a big commitment. Same thing with meditation. When I first started, it was a half hour, 2 times a day. It was very regimented. And after a while, especially with my creative schedule, that doesn't work. I work 8 hours. I'm writing constantly. I see clients on the side. It's kind of when needed. And I think after a while, if you're willing to take a tool that's given, but use it in your own way, people don't give themselves the creative bandwidth for that. You kind of take the whole thing hook, line, and sinker, and therefore you never go back to it,
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, because God, I just feel, totally stupid right now thinking of that, going, God, it never occurred to me that, it could just be here and there. It doesn't have to be this whole thing. I'm sort of the all or nothing, right? Like, if I'm going to start an exercise routine, then by God, it's 5 days a week, 6 days a week. We've got to do it, every minute. And then I fail, and then it just goes away and we don't do it anymore. And, and now you've got your Apple Watch telling you to stop and breathe and do all this stuff every now and then, but it's on these regimented schedules and it's every day and it's all this stuff. And so it becomes really difficult to commit to things. So it's funny because, it's such a little note, this idea that you don't have to do it every minute, that I think is really smart.
Make it easy. Make a list of everything that makes you feel really good. Make a list of what makes you feel like yourself and relaxed and happy. I have this for myself, big old list. And then when you have a little spare time, I always say 1 hour a day and 1 day a week for those kind of activities. Open your list, go what for today. It may be meditation, it may be running, it may be yoga, it may be a book, who knows? Just do it.
Yeah.
So you actually have a toolbox. You don't have to stick to a regimented routine. Most people do. They have their self-care routine, but it can get kind of restricted after a while. Make a list and just do what pops,
Well, and it's almost a little bit counterintuitive, right? To try and make something like this that's supposed to be relaxing, this whole
Not
thing,
relaxing at all.
And it's actually, I used to do a lot of yoga. I really enjoyed yoga. It was in a car accident when I was young, and I found that stretching and stuff did more for me than anything. And so I did a lot of yoga when I was younger, and I ultimately stopped going because the process, right? Having to stop and then go to the gym and then change and all this stuff. It was like, it outweighed the good. Like, it wasn't worth it to me to take an hour and a half or 2 hours out of my day. And so, ultimately, unfortunately, I don't go that often anymore. And so, because it just became too big a time suck. But if I could think of it or sort of reframe it as, 1 day a week, I'm going to go do yoga and it's going to be great. I could probably notch out a couple hours, once a week to go do something like that. So I think it's a profound, although seems like it should have been the most obvious observation. So I appreciate you saying that. One last thing I wanted to just ask you really quick as we sort of close here is, what is one thing that as an employer I can do to sort of see an impactful change in the way that we take care of mental health of our distributed teams? And then sort of the flip side of that coin, what can I as a remote worker do to take care of my own mental health needs?
I think from employer perspective, really look at the health of your ecosystem. You know what I mean? You're kind of in that creative role where you look at the ecosystem of your employees, the dynamics, the workflows, the processes, the expectations, all of that is part and parcel. And really be mindful about, like, is this actually lending to people's self-growth and self-care? Most of us don't look that way. We go, is it actually helping the bottom line? But if you actually put in that other, not that you have to give up the bottom line, I get that's not realistic, but if you actually add in that other element of question, is this actually contributing to their growth and their own care of themselves, you're going to actually have a lot of information start coming your way. I think it's a really good idea to take polls of your workforce once a year to kind of see how they're feeling, what do they like, what do they don't like, have their voices heard. Funny enough, that's usually when I get brought in for speaking engagements and or roundtables, is when there's been a ongoing theme of burnout or dissatisfaction. But that's a really great touchstone, because then you can go, wow, most of my top level people are having a hard time. Then you can actually start to look at what you can do to help them out. And then from remote work from home, from that perspective, I think you really have to kind of take the reins, I would say. Don't get sucked into other people's expectations, and you don't get sucked into that computer screen and that rote way of thinking of this is what my day is going to be. You actually have to start experimenting a little bit. Something so simple. I was noticing I had my Outlook for my computer for work. It dings every time I get a new email. And I would walk away just for a second to kind of get a drink of water or stretch or move. And I would hear a ding and I'd run to my laptop. And I would do that for like 9 hours a day. I'm like, nothing is that urgent that I have to respond that way to something dinging in the background here. I turned off my notifications. I know to check my email. I do it regularly. Doing these simple things of noticing what is kind of triggering your stress response. Okay, I need to make a change with that and start looking at your different options. Something so practical, but makes the world of a difference,
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
In fact, to that end, I have turned off notifications on my cell phone. It's always on vibrate. It's always on do not disturb kind of mode. I got rid of all the little red badges that every Apple thing has, because those are the worst. And, and all that kind of stuff. But basically it's to accomplish what you were just talking about is, there's honestly just nothing that urgent. You can take time for yourself and it's okay. So.
Yeah, I actually have a blog post about that if you go to my website. It's how I stopped living on hyperdrive. And it talks about my early days working in the ICU, where everything's stacked and running around, and heaven forbid you go to the bathroom kind of thing. And really looking at wow, I'm working in the ICU and none of what I'm doing is really stats. Stats a code. And none of this is that. So yes, I can take the time to get a drink of water. I can take a time to have 1 minute chat with somebody that lightens my mood. But so many of us don't look at that way. Look at where you're being hyper vigilant, or where you are kind of stressing yourself out more than needs to be stressed. Mm-hmm. That might not be anyone else's expectation. That might be something you're doing to yourself.
No, that's a great point to sort of wind down on. In closing, you just mentioned your blog. Where can people go find you online, learn more about you, or maybe make contact if they'd like to learn more?
Yeah, laurenpoly.com is my website, and that's got all my social media, my blog, videos, my book, and my weekly podcast. Everything's up there.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate your time and the energy it took to do this. And really grateful, like I say, for the information that you're sharing and everything. I think it's really valuable for our listening audience and for people in general. So thank you so much for being willing to share.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in this week and every week. And we'll see you all next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you anything.